Hello, welcome to the Feature Spotlight webinar for November 2025. Welcome to the webinar. We have a fair amount to talk about today, so let's go ahead and get right into it. As soon as I can figure out how to share my screen. All right, so this month we are going to talk about a couple of things. First, the upcoming 6.1.500 release. Been talking about it for a while. We're close to having it done. Not going to get it done as soon as we were hoping, but it is coming up soon. Then we're going to talk about some enhancements, one of which I think have a lot of potential. We'll talk about it when we get to that point, and we'll talk about some bug fixes that are coming up in the product. In the 6.1.500 release. Let's talk about 6.1.500. Our plan was to release it this month. That's not going to happen because there are several things that are included in this, many of which we've talked about over the last couple of months, like changing the SQL editor for SQL business values to use the Monaco editor, many accessibility changes and updates and fixes. There's just been a lot of stuff that we're throwing into 6.1.500. In fact, so much stuff that we've kind of branched off 6.1.500 into two separate releases. One will be .500, the other will be .600, it's looking like at the moment. So both of those are in the on-deck circle for release. Because of the delay, we went ahead and made an interim release of 6.1.350. I think we're now at 352 because we made some bug fix changes here and there, which is another thing that we're doing. And for you as a customer, it may be a little confusing, but the pace of releases is picking up. Because we now have a dedicated maintenance team to handle bugs and things like that, we're actually able to get the product out the door and to get fixes out the door faster than ever before. In one sense, that's great because when we find things that need to be fixed, we can fix them, we can get a release version out and get it up on the support website. That's great, and I'm sure everybody appreciates that. However, it's also confusing because now we get a lot of these incremental releases. So we are now on, I think the current release is 350, but prior to that, it was 6.1.300 and then 301 all the way up to 313. So there were like 14 releases within the space of 3 or 4 months. That's a pretty fast release cycle. It's also hard to keep up with if you're a customer because the release cycles do come so fast. The alternative to that is to have a much slower release cycle, which means a much longer time between your ability to get releases. So we are ramping up and have ramped up the release schedule, but we do understand that that might cause some confusion. It's very important then that you review the release notes page on the support website, the release notes page currently for version 6, so that you can look at these small incremental releases, which are largely bug fix releases, so that you can see what bugs are fixed in each, and then have a better idea of when to pull the trigger on uploads or upgrades. Understanding that if you were to upgrade at like version 6.1.311 and you think, okay, this has the fix that I want, then in 312 or 313, there may be other fixes that you go, I'd like that too. And we understand that you as a customer probably don't have the liberty to upgrade as often as we do releases. So it's important for you to look over those release pages to be sure that whenever you decide on doing an upgrade, that we're at a version that you're you're going to be happy with for a while, so you don't have to go through all of the pain associated with doing upgrades. I know for some of you, the upgrade process is relatively painful because you have all of this testing that has to be done and all this certification that needs to be done by your organization. Some of you have rules that are a little more loosey-goosey than that, but some, especially if you're one of our federal government partners, upgrades are a pain. And changing upgrade versions require you to jump through a whole bunch of hoops to upgrade. We understand that. We will work with you on things like that in terms of what it is that you're installing so that we can make that upgrade process easier. But there is always going to be that tension between a quick upgrade cycle with new versions coming out relatively frequently and the customer upgrade cycle and all of the pain and testing that you need to do on your end to do those upgrades. So for the major versions, of course, that largely goes away. It's the incremental versions that might cause that sort of pain. But for the main versions, we are thinking that December would be when we would come up with a beta release. That's unfortunate because December is a bad month. And having anybody do anything for the last 2 weeks in December is often a fool's errand. So we're thinking about a beta in December, and our plan is to sometime earlier in December to get 6.1.500 at least out to a group of beta customers. That would mean that you would probably be looking maybe at January for a full-fledged release. On the other hand, because we've had so many interim releases and we've had them out in the wild, and we've made so many changes that the delta between 6.1.352, which I think is the current interim release, the delta between that release and 6.1.500 is smaller than it would normally be in a major version or a minor version upgrade. So we're going to play a lot of this by ear, understanding that December is a bad month, and so our timing is going to be a little tricky on that. As time goes by, I'll have further updates to come. I'll probably have a much better idea of what the roadmap for those releases, 6.1.500 and then perhaps 600. I'll have a better idea in December what those releases look like. Let's talk about something I do know, and that is some of the enhancements that have made it into the product. The first one I think is a very interesting one, and it is the ability to produce digitally signed with certificates, PDF or PDZ files. So there is a new page in the system administration section. It is called PDZ Certificates. So here's what this enables us to do. On your Process Director installation, if you want to ensure that your certificates are valid and you want to sign them digitally, you can create certificates on your Process Director server to export and sign certificates. Now, that also means that you're going to need a public certificate on another server to import those certificates. So the first thing you have to do is generate the certificate on your Process Director server. So on the PDZ certificates page, there's a generate certificate link. You can click that and it will create your certificate. You don't have to do anything. Now, you have a certificate. You have a private certificate. And once you have that private certificate, you can use it to export PDZ files that are digitally signed. But you'll also need a public certificate for your other servers, right? So if you have 3 servers, let's say production, development, and staging, then each one of those servers is going to need its own private certificate, which you can generate from this page. but you're going to need the public certificate from your other two servers so that you can freely export and import PDZs back and forth between those servers. So you have your development server, which let's pretend this is. You have the private certificate. That's the certificate that will be used to digitally sign the PDZ file. So if this is the dev server and I export it, we're fine here. But when I go to my production server to import it, I'm going to need the public certificate from this server, this dev server, in order to install it. So there is a download public certificate link as well as a delete link. So you can delete certificates. But this download public certificate will, when clicked, download the public certificate to your system. And as you can see, I can go ahead and save my public certificate here. Now, as it happens, I've already done this. So we're not going to go through the save because I've already got one saved, but you can download that public certificate. Now, on your production server, then, you have, now that the certificate exists, and by the way, notice that now that this certificate exists, you no longer have the action link to generate the private certificate. That's already been done. You can only have one private certificate per server. So this server has its private certificate. However, I will need the public certificates from the other servers in my environment. So staging and production, let's say in this case. So I'm going to need to import that public certificate. So I would just click on that. I would give it a certificate name. So let's call this, let's pretend it's the prod certificate. So we'll just call this prod cert, and we'll choose our file. And this is a certificate file that I downloaded earlier. That's it, right? Well, that's the one that started to download, but this is the actual certificate here. That's my public certificate. And I can just go ahead now that I've chosen it, and I can import it. And now I have my private certificate, and I have this production certificate here, which is the public certificate. And it tells you the type, whether it's a public certificate, which has a .cer file extension, or the private certificate, which has a .pfx file extension. So with the public certificate, I can put that on any of my servers. Obviously, if I have 3 servers in my system, I would additionally need a certificate for my staging server. But now that I have both of these certificates on, I can now export and import back and forth between those 2 servers, and it will use that certificate to sign and then on import to verify that it is the correct certificate, that my server can read the signature and it can go ahead and import it. What that does is it prevents you from being able to import a PDZ file into any other server that does not contain that public certificate. This does change the UI very slightly. So if we wanted to export an item, so we'll just leave that for now. We'll go to this page, which is what we're going to look at next. And I decide that I want to export this object. So I click export. I now have a new property, which by default is checked, and it is called sign this PDZ file. Now, this property only exists if you have a certificate and you've generated one. Otherwise, you don't have any way of signing the PDZ file because you don't have a certificate. But once you have a private certificate, you can check or uncheck if you desire, depending on whether or not you want it signed, but the default will be to have it checked to provide a digital signature for the PDZ file. It'll sign it with your private certificate, and other systems can then perform an authentication on that file with the public certificate whenever they import it. So it does prevent someone from coming up with some weird third-party PDZ file to import onto your system, which you might not want. So it would have to come off of one of your systems, be signed properly before I could import it to any of the other of my systems, assuming, of course, that I have the certificate set up on each server. Now, the nice thing about this is that technically I would not need a certificate, say, on my prod server. What I would need is the public certificate from my development server in order to perform the import. But if you are running your production server solely as a target server, all my work is done on the dev server, which is the way it should be done, by the way. And I'm only going to export from dev to prod, but I'm never going to export from production back to dev. Then maybe you don't need the signature on your production server. You don't need the private certificate on your production server. If you do ever have to export, it will just export it as unsigned, and you can export it or import it into your dev server. And as long as you had your production server's public or your dev server's public certificate, you'd be fine. I'm not entirely sure why you would do that. If you're going to impose the certificates on your dev server, I'm not sure why you wouldn't impose them on all, but you could do that. Now, this is the first step in work with certificates, and I can't promise you that it will go much farther than this in the immediate future, but the ability to handle these certificates does mean that not only can we sign PDZ files, but potentially could encrypt them, which also means that we might be able to do the same with PDF files. The downside is that there's only one certificate per server. Now, you've had the ability to use certificates in Process Director prior to this. In fact, there was a custom task that enabled the use of certificates to encrypt or decrypt PDF files. But again, limitation for that private certificate, one per server. That's a big hurdle in the way that the certificate infrastructure works. But there is a chance that we can do a little bit more in the future with certificates in terms of signing and content list objects, perhaps signing as well, document attachments, and perhaps even encrypting. But this is the first step in getting a certificate infrastructure that is built directly into Process Director with its own UI on that PDZ certificates page. This is something that we might expand upon in the future. Watch this space carefully. The next thing we have to talk about is the new import files from File System CT. It's not a huge change to this CT. I have it configured on this form. Well, I don't have it configured, but I do have it attached to this form so we can look and see its configuration. And there is a new property, actually two new properties. The first one is zip directory before import. So this is import files from File System. So I have n number of files residing in a file folder somewhere out on my file system. Prior to this version of the CT, which is 2025.10.28, so at this point it's like 20 days old, this version does enable you to zip these directories, but prior to that, you couldn't. And whenever you had all of those files in a directory, you had to import them as is into Process Director. And if these were large files that were not zipped, big Word documents and stuff like that, well, they'd take up a lot of space on your system. This property enables us to take a look at that file system directory, find all of the objects in that directory, zip them into a zip archive, and then import that zip archive into the system rather than importing one zip archive rather than, say, 10 Word documents or PDF files or whatever, so that I just have this one zip file that gets imported. Obviously, that's going to reduce bandwidth because the zipping process makes all of those individual files much smaller. So I end up with a much smaller zip archive that potentially smaller than any single one of the Word documents that reside in the file system folder. And I can just bring them in as a zip archive, and they can be attached to a process just like any other file attachments. And of course, what that means is rather than having 10 file attachments on the form or process, I would have just one file attachment, which would be my zip file. And if people wanted access to the document, they could just download the individual zip file and then unzip it and look at all the documents. If you check this property, there is a zip file name. You don't have to fill this out. It is an optional property. If you don't fill it out, Process Director will create a timestamp as the file name, and we'll just name it, date time dot zip, and we'll create it. And by the way, if you don't put the .zip suffix, the file extension on the file name, don't worry about it. We'll add that for you if it doesn't exist. And of course, as always, this zip file name will recognize and parse system variables whenever you do the import of your zip file, and it names the zip file. So that is a change to the import files from file system, so that you can now import a whole bunch of files as a single zip archive, which should make your life a little bit easier. Another change to form SQL view permissions. So every form, as you probably know, has a form data SQL view tab that enables you to create a SQL view from the form. There are no fields on this form, so there's nothing really to create a view of, but up until now, only system administrators were allowed to create and edit form data SQL views. And that's been fine for a while because only administrators were really able to design stuff in Process Director prior to 6.1. With 6.1, of course, we've changed things a bit, and we now have this new class of users called developers. And one of our customers said, look, I understand why system administrators previously could only access this page, but now we have this user class of developers. I'd like developers to be able to access this page. So developers, get access to the home page, and they get access to the content list, even if they don't have permission to see many of the things in the content list. At least they have access to it, unlike end users. And so the problem was that developers did not have access to the form data SQL view. That was still reserved for system administrators. So we have changed this up now. The permissions have been extended so that now people who have development access can now access and edit the form data SQL view tab to make whatever SQL views that your developers need to make. And that way you don't have to just have system administrators assist with creating those items. And finally, for user exports, there is a column in the user administration, and it is called last login. You'll most likely see it whenever you look at a user's account and you look over here at this little information bar on the right-hand side, and you have your last login time. We were not exporting this. We had a customer, though, that was looking for something. They wanted to know about last login times, and so they did an export. Users are exported directly into Excel from Process Director if you want. And the last login was not part of the export. That's because it's a system data file. This data gets created in the system. It's part of the usage data. It's associated with the user account, but it's not really a fundamental field that would be available anywhere in the user profile. It's just sort of system data that happens to be associated with a user. But we didn't export that for that reason. However, if you're trying to track back at what different users are doing at different times, it might be useful to have that. So for exports only, the last login time now appears as one of the columns in the export. In fact, I think the way that we've got it set up now is we're just going to export everything. Now, if you have that column and you try to do an import, we're not going to do anything with it because potentially you could alter the last login time to insert false data in the system. That's not going to happen. So we're not going to look at those. So I guess I'd call them usage data fields. And actually, the usage data fields are really these here. We'll export them but whenever you import them, we're going to ignore them because what we care about is all of this data here that makes up your user settings, and that's what will get imported. But we have decided to go ahead and export, especially the last login time, as an export field for you. All right, so let's talk about some bug fixes in the time that we have left. Made some various display, CSS, and accessibility fixes. We have higher education customers from a couple of different states that are facing a hard deadline on in 2026. I think it's March 1st, 2026, for ensuring that every form that they have passes every WCAG AA level accessibility standard. And we have a lot of controls, and some of the controls based on the configuration that you use on them work differently. For example, we can show radio buttons as blocks for a radio button list. We can show them vertically. We can show them horizontally. There's a lot of controls that have different visual representations. So with some of our higher ed customers who are facing this hard deadline for full accessibility compliance, we're going through all of the various options that are available, and we're making accessibility and display and CSS fixes to ensure that they meet their accessibility mandates that are coming down next year. So that's going to be a big part of any bug fixes that we do in the product. Another weird little issue, it only shows up if you had tabbed forms. If you were in an event field in a tabbed form, and rather than exiting the event field, you clicked on the tab, the event field event would be lost, I guess, is the only way of putting it. And the tab click event would substitute for the event. What you really need is for both events to fire. I'm in an event field. I click on a tab. Two things are going to happen. A, the event field where the cursor currently is going to lose focus. At that point, I need to check to see if I can fire, or I should fire, the field event. For example, if I've changed the data, I should fire the field event. Once that field event fires, then I should move on to the tab event. So those event crashes we had to look into and fix. A weird issue that I'm not sure where it came from or why, it just cropped up suddenly. If you used the form field system variable for a user picker as a knowledge view column, so there's a whole string of things that have to happen before you see this error, then when you run the knowledge view, you're going to get the information that you want about the user. You're also getting a whole bunch of other information about the user that you necessarily didn't want. What you expect to see is what you normally see when you throw a form field system variable for a user picker. You expect to see the user's name. And it was showing you the name and their UID and their user ID. Not sure why that happened, but that's a game of too much information that the knowledge view was playing, so we had to address that. Another issue that's a little more understandable, the user picker was not retaining the form data for disabled users. So I have an old form. I picked Bob as my user and I saved the form. And then a year later, Bob leaves the company and I disable Bob as a user. But for some reason, I have to go back and open up that old form. Well, Bob as the user should still be saved in that form. But whenever I opened the form, because Bob was disabled and he didn't show up in the galaxy of active users, it would erase Bob from the form field and it would show up as blank because there was no Bob. So that's just a case of checking for the logic of whether that user had been disabled or not. And we fixed that so that now the user picker, and that was a error that only existed, I think, very briefly in 6.1.3 something, and has now been fixed, or will be fixed in .350. Another problem with activity restart logic, some activities were showing as having been restarted when they weren't. So the process timeline was kind of losing track of these activities. And it was also, you would never see it unless you had a specific configuration. I don't remember off the top of my head what the configuration was. But these activities showed up as having been restarted when in fact those activities had run and had stopped and had never been restarted. So it was just a case of keeping track properly of what the activity had done and was doing. A final issue that we had to address was an unexpected log off issue where users would be on the system, they would be active, and then all of a sudden they would get, you're no longer logged in, you have to log in again. So it interrupted what they were doing. They'd have to go back and log in. And these were users that were actively using the system. Some reason they were showing up as inactive and were being automatically logged off by the system. So it was an issue with session tracking for individual users that we had to investigate and fix. But with that done, that is all that we have for you today for this particular webinar. So I think that means that as of now, we are done. Thanks for joining me. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. For those of you who attend the training webinar, I'll look forward to seeing you on Thursday. For the rest of you, we'll look forward to seeing you next month. So long.